Good afternoon. I'm very happy to participate in this Congress. I'm also happy to be part of the international network of scholars who work on internal and external debt. The title of my talk is US Debt and Global Crisis. I will go over some of the things pretty quickly because of the time constraint, but you will have the slides and also I have given references in appropriate places so that you can find those references and go through them to satisfy yourselves. Furthermore, on this title page, you will also find my email address in the US, and I'll be very happy to communicate with any of you through email in English, French, or Spanish, or some other languages that are Asian languages. But I think English, Spanish, and French should suffice for this group. Thank you again, and let me begin. I want to begin with something that many of you know. This is a Gramscian perspective about crisis. Gramsci told us many years ago, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And I submit, debt crisis or debt problems, to put it more mildly, is one such morbid symptom. We will explore the why, how, and the consequences of this in both economic and political terms. That is to say, truly in political economic terms. So what is the overall framework? I call it a global political economy framework. Of course, I should add a critical global political economy framework. And the key propositions are: the global political economy has a complex systemic structure. There is, for example, interaction of public with private debt. There are many contradictions. The US economy, along with the EU and PRC, is an important complex subsystem of this complex system. And each one of these subsets or subsystems has a set of contradictions of their own. Finance capital today is largely a creation of debt for speculation, and contradictions abound here again. I will say this much, that the creditor countries, for example, PRC, is not using this for speculation, but certainly the US, which is now the world's largest debtor country in terms of foreign debt to others, certainly is doing that. And then these contradictions are what we want to study. And we also want to do this specifically in terms of dialectics of uneven and combined development, order, disorder, and crisis. That is to say, we can find, if we study it carefully, an increase in entropy in our global political economy. And US, it must be pointed out, is the leader in crisis. And there is a dialectical interaction of public and private debt here, but that's just the beginning, as it were, of the unfolding crisis that we actually see happening right in front of our very eyes here. What is the US debt clock looking like? I will go through this very quickly. The US government's public debt is now more than $22 trillion, the highest it has ever been. The new debt level reflects a rise of more than $2 trillion from the day President Trump took office in 2017. Furthermore, about 39% of the debt is held by foreigners, especially PRC, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. And since the 1940s, this is really the highest level the debt has reached. There is a connection between deficits and debt, of course, and I will not go through that more, but I want to point out that this is special today. The deficit typically grows during recessions. when tax receipts shrink and demand for food stamps and other government assistance rises, then falls during good times. The current spike in the deficit at a time of strong economic growth and low unemployment represents a break with that historical pattern, and I submit it's not an accidental break. Global debt to GDP is also rising, and right now it's over 327% of global GDP. It was up 50 trillion in 10 years at 2017 first quarter, and since then it has grown by more than another $5 trillion. There is this fallacy I should point out, but I should also qualify this immediately. My friends at University of Massachusetts Amherst recalculated from the data by a famous study and found that actually the debt to GDP ratio over 90% is largely a red herring raised by these people. However, the interaction between public debt and private debt is not something that they looked at, and that would be one of the things that I would want to point out in my talk. Now, public and private debt are together going to increase. Public debt will rise to about 95% of GDP and keep rising, and that's not a danger signal really, but private debt is something that we should look at along with public debt. And the tax cuts by Trump, they have definitely added to deficits and to debt. And by the year 2027, that deflationary period, which will certainly ensue in a year or so, might come to an end with an inflationary period, but that's a long time from today. Now, let me look at this a little more carefully. The tax cut really is not going to lead to that much growth, because the best models we have predict, as is shown in the red here, only between 0.03 and 0.09 percentage point growth as a result of these tax cuts. So what are the political aspects? My best political guess is that over the next decade, social programs will be cut more than any other part of US budget. But this will generate resistance as well. Politics for the rich will be challenged. I do not see government spending on infrastructure, but some companies may receive windfalls. Now let's turn to US private debt that will surely interact in the coming years with public debt. The highest so far was 213.4%, lowest was 155.7% of GDP. From 2016 to 2018, it has hovered around 200%. More than 30% of this private debt is also held by foreigners. And foreign holdings have been rising since 1990. I have given for comparison figures from some of these other countries: Canada, the Netherlands, South Korea, Japan, UK, and France. And clearly the situation is not any better in these countries, and same kind of interactions between public and private debt will occur here. Now, what are the general conclusions regarding private sector finances? First of all, private debt to GDP uniformly over 200% in all advanced countries. US leadership is clearly in crisis. No effective global financial architecture is there since the demise of the Bretton Woods institutions. Therefore, private sector debt crises with synchronicity are highly likely. And systemic and terminal crisis of world capitalist system might actually be arriving, as Giovanni Arrighi quite insightfully pointed out in his book, The Long 20th Century. Just for comparison, you can look at China public debt, which is really very, very small. And let's look at the debt crisis from Asian financial crisis onwards. I have given the references there that might be helpful to you. the dividing line between public and private debt and capital has become blurred. And I was the first one really to point that out. And surprisingly, Piketty actually waits till the very end of his book, and on page 569 of his famous book, he actually reaches the same conclusion as I had done 10 years before him. What about the 2008 global crisis? Unfortunate confirmation of my theory for the 21st century, that the 21st century crisis of capitalism will be global, came to fruition. And rapidly evolving financial fragility, something that was pointed out a few of us as early as the late 1990s, had its effects. The global nature of crisis from 1997 onwards is something we should notice. We should also notice the inability of IMF and national policymakers in the US and EU to take pro-people steps to solve this problem. And I have given you some further references there that I hope will help you. What about corporations? Are they leveraging now? Investors have become increasingly concerned about the state of the credit market. Companies have borrowed heavily during the era of easy money. Since 2007-8, the proportion of corporate bonds, S&P, has raised speculative grade or junk has climbed to about 50% from 40%, and they're climbing even more, and no end to speculation is in sight yet. Therefore, financial fragility has to be considered seriously, and my proposition here is the main cause of financial crisis is financial fragility. The role of multi-regional financial architecture, forthcoming in my essay on BRICS and Emerging Economies Handbook from Oxford University Press, explains this further. And also I have another paper on artificial intelligence, learning and crisis, and I reach similar conclusion, even more ominously so than before. So financial fragility is something that is a fact of life in world capitalist system. And here I present to you what I call a capital proposition and its corollary. The proposition is the deeper structural causes have to do with chronic malfunctioning of a global capitalist system in crisis. And the depressing political corollary is initially a move towards neo-fascism that the neoliberal ruling classes may end up accepting, maybe in order. In fact, we see more than the initial stages of this happening already in many countries, including the United States and some European countries as well. What is the cure? Deleveraging will not be enough. So there is no permanent cure within global capitalism and its regulatory mechanisms and institutions. The Bretton Woods institution type medium-term fix is possible, but unlikely given the political situation and thinking right now. A new international workers of the world organization is needed, and that is the most important task of progressive people everywhere. The maximum and minimum programs for the new international will need to be formulated. I should point out that Samin Amin, just before he passed away last year, called for this. PRC is different, but I don't want to spend too much time on this, and just point out that although PRC will survive crisis better than other countries perhaps, it is not a model of 21st century democratic socialism. And in private debt, PRC is not really so different from the others either. Now let me get to conclusions. I have formulated these conclusions in 3 sets. First set, global financial climate is non-inflationary and stagnationist in spite of Chinese, Indian, and US growth. There's mainly growth in low-skilled jobs, and high-tech and artificial intelligence probably will replace or displace more workers with low to medium skills and even some high-skilled jobs as well. Interaction of public debt and private debt, most likely a crisis scenario in US as part of global neo-fascism. So what can be the strategy of movements from below? My second set of conclusions are geared towards answering this question. We need, I would submit, a global dialectical reform revolution in 21st century. This is really an updating of Rosa Luxemburg's early 20th century formulation, her brilliant formulation of thinking dialectically about reforms and revolution together. Private sector, of course, needs to deleverage, but that's merely a reform. Some renationalization contra privatization is required, but by itself it's also reform. A hybrid new global financial architecture with augmented innovation system, as I have called this type of innovation systems, will help, but also ultimately by itself it's just a reform. All these reforms are very important, but by themselves they cannot solve the deep crisis of capitalist accumulation. So my last set of conclusions. Fighting only for reforms will not be enough. We need to learn from Luxemburg and Gramsci strategically and apply this globally dialectical reform revolution approach. And I have identified them in two categories, but they should work together. And the tactics should be flexible so that we do not become rigid in applying these. So first strategic set is to defeat the neoliberals and nationalists. A neo-Gramscian global prince probably is in order. Those of you who have read Gramsci, and I'm sure almost all of you have, you will appreciate what I mean here. And the second set that must work together with the first is to move towards a democratic socialism to build a new international for this purpose. I have no doubt that the global crisis will be deepening, but along with it also will be deepening people's critical consciousness, and there will emerge new organizations, new struggles led by new leaders, especially from among the young people. So I remain firmly optimistic and Gramscian. Gramsci said that we need optimism of will and pessimism of intellect. So we should practice both. Thank you.